Hi everybody, today I'll be talking about John Hinckley and the self-object. Kohut described the self-object as an object that is experienced as a part of the self rather than independent of the self. When we are born, our parents are our first self-objects. To our infant minds, they are the godlike measure of the world and the primary archetypes for our relationships in the future. As our first self-objects, our parent or parents' quality of attachments during our earliest years of development have a profound impact on our subsequent developmental phases. Abuse, whether physical or psychological, neglect, or an inconsistent, unstable presence of the mother or father in the child's life can arrest social and psychosexual development by creating a self that lacks cohesion. If an archaic self-object or objects, in this case parents or caregivers, are dysfunctional, when the child reaches adulthood, it is not unusual that they'll transfer the subconscious archetypal dynamics of the parent or parents on to the objects in future relationships, whether romantic, platonic, or professional. This is common for everyone, whether having a healthy integrated self or not. The self-object may be a person, physical object, activity, or a political or religious doctrine. Regardless, it replaces the archaic self-object as a subconscious source for self-soothing, security, and meaning. In a previous video, I identified Adolf Hitler's self-object as Nazism. Nazi doctrine that he had developed unified his unconscious self by ideologically transferring his love for his German mother upon the German people, while also transferring his hatred for his violent alcoholic half-Jewish father upon the Jewish people. Lee Harvey Oswald's self-object was communism, Ted Kaczynski's was primitive anarchism, and John Hinckley's self-object was the actress Jodie Foster. John W. Hinckley Jr. was born on May 29, 1955, to Joanne and John W. Jack Hinckley Sr. in Ardmore, Oklahoma. He was the youngest of three siblings after Diane, who is the second oldest, and Scott, who is the oldest. John's father, Jack, was a wealthy oilman who had served in the Navy during World War II. Jack had come from a background where he had been raised by a stepfather and in which he was competitive with his sister when it came to hard work and achievement. Before serving in the Navy, he had graduated from the University of Oklahoma with a degree in mechanical engineering. He had also been in several honor societies, was class vice president, and had played in a band. In 1946, he got a high-paying job at Carter Oil Company and married his class sweetheart, Joanne Moore. At the mere age of 21, Jack had achieved more in his life than most do in their entire lives. He expected everyone was capable of such achievements, including his children. Due to his line of work, Jack and Joanne moved 14 times during their first 5 years of marriage. The move to Dallas, Texas in 1958 took a severe toll, especially on Joanne. Jack had branched off on his own as an independent oil consultant. His new self-employment caused him to work long hours that left him little time for Joanne or the kids. Joanne was overwhelmed with the transition from a slow-paced town like Ardmore to a hectic big city like Dallas. She was alone most of the time without her friends or the support of her church back in Ardmore. Scott and Diane were in school and adapted to the move with little or no difficulties. However, Joanne's social anxiety and agoraphobia, which she had started to develop after the move, from being out in public, had a formative influence on 3-year-old John, who was always around and modeling after her. She spent a lot of time crying and was too wrapped up at times to meet his emotional and psychological needs. Joanne contacted her mother, who came from Oklahoma to help her with the kids. One day at the grocery store, John's grandmother noticed that he was clinging to Joanne's dress as if his life depended upon it. When asked why he was so scared to be out in public, Joanne merely told her that he was unfamiliar with the store. John's resentment toward his father also began at this time, as he had to compete with Jack for Joanne's attention, especially since Jack rarely gave him any attention. The family moved to a new upscale neighborhood in Dallas called University Park. Joanne also began to adapt better to the city by seeing a psychiatrist and becoming more involved in the local Episcopal church. John, however, didn't seem to move forward from the difficult period, however. Around the time he entered elementary school, he played sports and other activities with kids his age. During adolescence, he started to isolate himself from others. While his friends started to date girls and participate more in extracurricular activities, he stayed at home in his room. He also never outgrew his obsessive dependency on his mother. John's competition with Jack for Joanne's attention strained their marriage. Jack had made a few attempts to bond with John when he was a young kid. They went on a couple of trips together. They also participated in an activity at the YMCA called Indian Guides, where they both wore Indian headdresses and sat in a circle with other headdress-wearing fathers and sons making leather belts. Typically, Jack would humiliate John in front of the family, comparing him to the more sociable and successful Diane and Scott. Joanne tried her best to counter Jack's ridicule by spoiling John with cookies and casseroles. Having Joanne as his sole source of emotional support and validation, as well as being reclusive during high school, caused John to regress socially. His psychosexual level was still at the level of a 13-year-old when he graduated from high school in 1973. This accounts for the later attraction to teenage actress Jodie Foster as well as underage prostitutes. After graduating from high school, it was expected that John would go to college like his siblings. Jack decided that John would major in business at Texas Tech in Lubbock. John had no interest in business. He was interested in poetry and music. He wrote his own songs, which he played with an electric guitar Jack and Joanne gave him as a child. Jack didn't think that John's interests were realistic, yet despite John's requests not to be sent to Texas Tech to study business, he was moved away to Lubbock. Jack and Joanne then sold the family home and moved to Evergreen, Colorado, which was a suburb of Denver. In addition to being exiled, as he referred to being sent off to college, he couldn't even return to the home where he had grown up. Jack wanted John to be as far away from Joanne and their marriage. He was too needy and draining on their relationship. In John's mind, however, he had been mercilessly abandoned in the world. He expected this from his father, but not his beloved mother, his self-object. He began to call and write letters complaining about various physical ailments and not having enough money. His weight increased to 230 pounds while in Lubbock. John finally dropped out of college in 1976. He wrote a letter to Jack and Joanne informing them that he had dropped out because he was moving to Hollywood so he could sell his songs to any record company that would buy them. He wanted to be a musician since he first heard the Beatles when he was young. John Lennon was an inspiration to him personally as well as musically. John was in Hollywood for barely a week when he called them asking for money. He claimed he had been robbed and was begging for change on the street. When Jack found out that he had sold the Camaro that he had bought John for school and used the money to travel to Hollywood, he was furious. Joanne merely acted by weeping. Despite their disappointment, they wired John money so he could pursue his goal in a career in music. While living in Hollywood, John saw a film, Taxi Driver, with Robert De Niro, Sybil Shepherd, and 14-year-old actress Jodie Foster. The feelings of abandonment had shattered his idealized parental imago as mother. In this case, it was the ideal image of her as a self-object. Jodie Foster, who played a teenage prostitute, Iris, in the film, filled that void. His infatuation with her soon developed into an obsession. John began to collect any photos, magazine articles, and newspaper clippings of her he could find. He also wrote poems and love songs about her. John had also identified with the film's protagonist, Travis Bickle, played by Robert De Niro, who is a Marine veteran and taxi driver who in the film tries to assassinate a politician after he is rejected by a female campaign organizer. He later decides to violently save Iris from her pimps. Just as a side note, screenwriter Paul Schrader loosely based the character Travis Bickle off of Arthur Bremer, who shot Democratic presidential candidate George Wallace in 1972. In 1980, John found out in People magazine that Jodie Foster was going to attend Yale that fall. He had returned to living with his parents after a few more failed attempts at personal independence. He had to meet her, yet he knew that Jack wouldn't let him travel to Yale University campus in New Haven, Connecticut, without a legitimate reason. So John lied to them about wanting to attend a writer's workshop there in the fall. He also was able to persuade Jack to take out money from his trust fund for the trip and living expenses. Jack withdrew $3,600. John flew to New Haven on September 7th, 1980, and wasted no time in calling Jodie Foster at her dormitory. He was able to talk to her briefly, but she wasn't interested in any further contact. Over the next 3 days, he made numerous attempts to call her, leaving her love notes and trying to meet her personally on campus. Having exhausted all attempts at successfully courting her, John was devastated. He called Joanne and told her that he didn't like the writer's workshop and wanted to come home. Jack, as usual, was furious after finding out that John changed his mind about Yale. He was so angry that he didn't want to see John when he returned. Instead, he flew to California to attend a conference held by World Vision, a Christian relief organization he had been volunteering with overseas. Having been rejected by his self-object, John returned to his normal depression and aimlessness. However, his obsession with Jodie Foster didn't go away, nor did his anger toward his parents for abandoning him. During his long sojourn back to Evergreen following his stay in New Haven, John contemplated suicide among other violent options that ran through his mind, but decided to take out his violent anger by assassinating the president instead. His decision to try to assassinate Jimmy Carter was not based on any political views. He reasoned that by assassinating the most powerful man in the world, he would show Jodie Foster how powerful he was. On an Oedipal level, he would also be subconsciously killing his father, who was represented as a male figure of power and authority, in order to be closer to his mother, the archaic self-object, which was replaced by Jodie Foster in this case. John began to stalk Jimmy Carter. On October 6, 1980, he got close enough to shake hands with the president at an election rally in Dayton, Ohio. When asked later why he didn't make the attempt then, John reported that he merely wanted to see how close he could get first. He planned to assassinate Carter in Nashville, but was arrested at the airport. The police confiscated his guns and held him for 4 to 5 hours before releasing him. John subsequently bought two .22 caliber pistols in Dallas while visiting with Diane and his young nephew. He decided to stop pursuing Carter since it was an election year. He decided to wait until a new president was elected. His parents decided to have John see a psychiatrist after he had returned to Evergreen. Like with college and everything else, the goals of therapy were for Jack's convenience rather than effectively helping John. The therapy was centered on a contract between John and his parents whereby he had to find a job in his own place by certain deadlines. In between sessions, John flew to Washington, D.C. and began stalking Ronald Reagan, who would be beginning his term as president in a couple of months. On December 8th, he took a break from his stalking to be a part of the vigil that had been started by fans in honor of John Lennon, who had just been assassinated in New York. While mourning with fellow fans outside of John Lennon's apartment, John met a young female fan with whom he had his first sexual experience. That particular fan was underage. Though he continued to see his psychiatrist, Dr. Hopper, he mentioned nothing of his travels to New Haven to see if he could spot Jodie Foster at Yale. Nor did he mention to Dr. Hopper that he had been and was continuing to stalk Reagan and other possible political targets. In February, he even waited outside Senator Ted Kennedy's office with a gun, but the congressman never showed. On January 21st, 1981, John bought a Charter Arms .38, which was the same gun Mark David Chapman had used to shoot John Lennon. Prior to one of his trips to the East Coast, John left a note for Jack and Joanne. It simply said, "Your prodigal son has taken off again to exorcise some demons." There was no indication of where he went or what he had planned to do. His parents had been on a week-long trip to Arizona and discovered the note when they returned on March 1st. A few days later, they received a call at 4:30 in the morning from John. He told them that he was tired, hungry, penniless, and wanted to come home. On March 7th, when they picked him up at the airport, Jack told John that he had broken every promise that he had ever made to them. He gave John $200 and told him to go stay at the YMCA. Jack finished by telling him that from then on he was on his own. John reacted as if Jack was telling him to grow another limb. In John's mind, they were betraying him. And in order to avoid ego disillusion by having been rejected by his archaic self-object, Joanne, John realized that he had to win over Jodie Foster's love and affection. In his mind, the only way he could do this was by assassinating the president. On March 30th, 1981, the day he shot the president, he wrote his last letter to Jodie Foster before his assassination attempt. In it, he described the urgency of winning her over, as if it was life or death. "I would abandon this idea of getting Reagan in a second if I could win your heart and live out the rest of my life with you, whether it be in total obscurity or whatever," he wrote. He also wrote, "I will admit to you that the reason why I'm going ahead with this attempt now is because I cannot wait any longer to impress you. I've got to do something now to make you understand in no uncertain terms that I am doing all of this for your sake." John may have thought on a conscious level that he was doing it for Jodie's sake. However, on a subconscious level, he was trying to preserve his narcissistic ego with the delusional view that he could win over Jodi's affections and establish a courtship with Jodi if he carried out the violent act.